the drowning wolf. Mark had always loved exploring the forests near his camp. They were dark, mysterious, and full of sounds he couldn't explain. But today was different. Today, something was wrong. The usual peaceful silence of the forest had been replaced by a strange, almost desperate sound. It echoed in the air, carried by the wind. He paused, his heart racing as the cry cut through the stillness. It wasn't a bird or an animal he knew. It was something more urgent. Without thinking, Mark dropped his gear and hurried towards the sound, pushing his way through the dense underbrush. He moved faster now, his curiosity growing. The sounds were getting louder, closer. Mark stumbled into a clearing and stopped, dead in his tracks. Before him was a deep, dark pool of water, and in the middle of the pool was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen before. A massive alien wolf, its fur sleek and shining, was thrashing in the water. Its glowing blue eyes were wide with fear. The creature's movements were frantic, and Mark could see it was struggling to stay above the surface. It looked so powerful, so majestic, yet now it was drowning. The wolf's sharp claws scratched the surface of the water in vain, its body sinking deeper with each passing second. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't just stand there and watch. Without hesitation, he dove into the water, pushing through the cold, murky depths. The wolf's glowing eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Mark felt a strange connection between them. The wolf's desperation seemed to reach out to him, pulling him in. The coldness of the water made it hard to breathe. Mark swam toward the wolf, kicking his legs harder as he got closer. The creature's movements became weaker, its massive form growing limp in the water. Mark reached out and grabbed the wolf's fur, pulling it toward him with all his strength. It was heavy, much heavier than he had expected, but Mark didn't stop. He kicked his legs harder, fighting against the current, pushing through the water, until finally he reached the shore. His lungs burned with the need for air, but he refused to stop. He dragged the wolf onto the land, exhausted but determined to help. The wolf collapsed onto the ground, its body heaving with the effort to breathe. Mark knelt beside it, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature's blue eyes were still open, watching him with an intensity that felt almost human. Mark was surprised by the intelligence he saw in those eyes. "Easy, big guy," Mark whispered, his voice soothing. "You're safe now." The wolf let out a low growl, but it wasn't a warning. It was more of a tired acknowledgement. Mark gently stroked the creature's fur, surprised at how soft it was despite the coldness. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The forest around them was quiet, as if holding its breath. Mark continued to watch the wolf, unsure of what to do next. He had no idea how long it had been in the water, or what had caused it to be there in the first place. The forest was full of secrets, and he was beginning to feel that this was no ordinary creature. Just as Mark thought the wolf might be done for, it suddenly stirred. Its eyes glowed brighter, and it let out a low, almost pained growl. Mark's eyes widened as the wolf slowly pushed itself onto its feet. The creature was shaking, its legs weak, but it wasn't giving up. Mark stepped back, giving it space, his mind racing. He had no idea what kind of creature he had just saved, but it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The wolf's eyes seemed to look directly into his soul, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that it understood him. The creature slowly turned its head, looking out into the forest, and then it glanced back at Mark. It wasn't frightened anymore, but there was a strange, unspoken question in its gaze. What now? Mark whispered to himself. The wolf took a hesitant step forward, its paws leaving soft imprints in the earth. It was as if the forest itself was watching the strange bond that had formed between the two. The wolf moved toward the edge of the clearing, glancing back at Mark once more. Mark stood frozen, still unsure of what was happening. Should he follow it? Should he stay? His heart told him to go after the wolf, but his mind wasn't sure he was ready for whatever lay ahead. Without another word, the wolf turned and disappeared into the thick underbrush, leaving Mark standing in the clearing, still gasping for air. His mind was racing, his heart pounding. Something had just happened. Something important. But he didn't know what. The wolf was gone, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. The forest had just revealed its first secret, and Mark knew, deep down, it wouldn't be the last. The whispering forest Mark sat by the fire that evening, the crackling of the flames, the only sound breaking the eerie silence around him. His mind raced with questions. The wolf, what was it? Where did it come from? Why had it been in the water? And why had he been the one to find it? He stared into the flames, trying to make sense of the strange encounter. The forest had always been quiet, peaceful even, but tonight felt different. It was as if the trees themselves were whispering, as if the air was thick with something unspoken. His gaze flickered toward the edge of the camp. The wolf was still out there, somewhere, and he had no idea where it had gone. Mark had set up his tent earlier, but now he wasn't sure he wanted to sleep. The forest felt alive, watching him. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw something moving. His breath caught in his throat, but when he turned to look, the shadows were still. He shook his head, trying to push away the feeling, but it lingered. It felt as though something was watching him from the darkness, hidden just out of sight. He stood up, grabbing a flashlight from his bag. He needed to check on his supplies, make sure everything was secure. But as he stepped toward the edge of the clearing, he froze. A faint whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, reached his ears. It was so quiet that Mark wasn't sure he had even heard it. He stood still, straining his ears, trying to make out any sound. It came again, this time clearer. Come closer. The voice was not human. It was deep and melodic, but there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't just a whisper in the wind. It felt like it was coming from within his own mind. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, and his heart started to race. He looked around the clearing again. No one was there. The trees, the rocks, the shadows, they all looked the same. Yet, there was something different now. He was no longer alone. The whisper came again, louder this time. Come closer. Mark's hands trembled as he held the flashlight. His feet seemed to move of their own accord, stepping deeper into the forest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was pulling him toward something he couldn't understand. The trees parted ahead, revealing a narrow path. It wasn't the path he had taken earlier that day, but it seemed to appear out of nowhere. Mark hesitated, the voice still echoing in his mind, urging him forward. You must know the truth. Mark's mind raced. Should he follow? Should he turn back? The rational part of him screamed to stop, to leave the forest and go back to the safety of his camp. But the pull, the whisper in his mind, it was too strong. It felt as if something in the forest was calling to him, something important, something he needed to understand. Before he could make a decision, he heard a rustling behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. His heart pounded as he quickly scanned the area. The wolf, it had returned. Mark's eyes widened as he saw the glowing blue eyes of the wolf staring at him from the edge of the clearing. The creature was moving slowly, cautiously, but it wasn't afraid. It seemed to be waiting, its gaze fixed on him, as if urging him to follow. The whispers returned. This time from the wolf. Come with me. Without another thought, Mark stepped forward, following the wolf into the forest. The creature moved silently ahead, leading him down the narrow path. The trees closed in around them, the darkness swallowing them both. The air grew colder, and the whispers became louder, more urgent. Mark didn't know what was waiting ahead, but the wolf's presence comforted him. The creature's glowing eyes lit up the path ahead, cutting through the darkness like beacons. Mark followed closely, his feet crunching on the forest floor. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest seemed. The trees were taller, their branches twisted in unnatural shapes. The shadows moved, dancing around them, and Mark began to wonder if he had crossed into some kind of strange, unknown realm. Eventually, they reached a clearing, but this one was different. The ground was covered in soft, glowing moss, and in the center stood a massive stone arch, its surface covered in strange, ancient markings. The wolf stopped in front of the arch and turned to face Mark, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. Mark felt a sense of awe and fear wash over him. He knew, deep down, that whatever was behind this arch, whatever secret it held, was the key to everything. The wolf looked at him one last time, its eyes full of meaning, before it turned and walked toward the arch. Mark followed, unsure of what to expect, but unable to resist the pull. He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat as he passed beneath the stone arch. The moment he crossed through, the world seemed to shift. The air hummed with energy, and the whispers stopped. Before him stood something Mark could never have imagined: a stone structure, ancient and worn, yet powerful. It looked like a doorway, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its shape was irregular, almost alien, and it glowed faintly, as if waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. Mark stared at it in awe. The wolf stood at the base, waiting. "This is the beginning," the wolf's voice echoed in his mind. Mark knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. The hidden Mark. The night passed in a blur. Mark barely slept, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The forest, the whispers, the mysterious stone arch, and the wolf. It was all too much. He lay awake in his tent, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The next morning, the forest seemed calm again. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft rays of light onto the forest floor. It almost felt like nothing had changed. But Mark knew better. Something had shifted. He could feel it in the air. The forest wasn't the same, and neither was he. He stood up and stretched, shaking off the lingering fog of sleep. The wolf was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't surprise him. It had led him to the stone arch last night, but now it seemed to have disappeared once again. Mark couldn't help but feel an odd sense of loss. The wolf had been his guide, his only connection to whatever strange force had taken hold of the forest. Now it was gone. Mark's thoughts drifted to the glowing moss in the clearing, to the mysterious structure, and to the strange, ancient markings that had covered the stone arch. He had crossed beneath it without fully understanding what it was, but now he felt something deep within him change, a shift in his very being. He looked down at his arm, noticing a dull ache there. It wasn't painful, just a strange sensation, like something was pressing against his skin. He frowned and rubbed the spot, but it only grew more intense. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled up his sleeve. There, on his forearm, was a mark. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a faint glow, a soft light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. But as he stared at it, the mark began to take shape. The glowing light revealed intricate, swirling patterns, like some sort of alien script. It wasn't like anything Mark had seen before. A wave of dizziness hit him as he tried to make sense of it. The patterns seemed to move on their own, shifting and rearranging as if they were alive. His skin tingled where the mark was, and he felt an overwhelming surge of energy flow through him, like something powerful had been awakened. He stumbled back, his breath coming faster. Was this connected to the wolf, to the forest, the arch? Mark's mind raced, but before he could make any conclusions, a sharp noise from behind him broke his concentration. He spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. It was the wolf. The creature stood in the doorway of his tent, watching him with those glowing blue eyes. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the wolf, trying to understand. It didn't look like it had before. The wolf's fur seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, its eyes brighter than ever. The wolf took a step forward, its gaze not leaving Mark. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for him to act. Suddenly, Mark felt the pull again, the call to follow the wolf. The mark on his arm pulsed with energy, and he knew, without a doubt, that he couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever this was, whatever had been awakened within him, he had to understand it. He walked toward the wolf, his feet moving almost on their own. The wolf didn't hesitate. It turned and began to walk, leading him back toward the forest. Mark followed, the mark on his arm glowing faintly as he moved deeper into the woods. He could feel something was coming, something that would change everything. As they walked, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter, almost as if it too was holding its breath. The trees closed in around them, and the path became narrow, winding through thick underbrush. Mark's heart raced as they ventured further into the unknown. The air felt different now, heavier, charged with an energy that Mark couldn't explain. He glanced down at his arm again, watching the mark pulse with every step he took. He had never felt anything like this before. It was as if the mark was connected to the forest itself, like it had been there for centuries, waiting for him to find it. The wolf stopped suddenly, turning its head to look at Mark. It was standing in front of a large rock, one that seemed out of place. It was jagged, towering over the forest floor, and its surface was covered in the same strange markings that had been on the stone arch. Mark stepped forward, his eyes widening as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a rock. It was part of something larger, something ancient. The markings seemed to call to him, urging him to touch the surface. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the stone. As soon as he made contact, a jolt of energy shot through him. His body stiffened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The world around him seemed to disappear, leaving only the mark on his arm and the markings on the stone. The energy was overwhelming, like it was feeding directly into him. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. The wolf growled low, its ears flattening against its head as it backed away. Mark pulled his hand back from the stone, gasping for breath. The tremors stopped, and everything was silent once again. But Mark knew. Something had changed. The mark on his arm was brighter now, glowing with an intensity that was almost blinding. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest was no longer just a forest. It was something else, something alive, and it had noticed him. The wolf turned and ran off into the trees, its glowing eyes the last thing Mark saw before it disappeared. Mark stood there, his mind racing. What had just happened? What had he unlocked? He didn't know, but he could feel it. The adventure he had stumbled into was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The ancient secret Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, staring at the glowing mark on his arm. The energy from the stone had surged through him, leaving him breathless. But it wasn't just the strange force he had encountered. It was something else, something deeper, something ancient. The forest was quiet again. The only sound, the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Mark took a step forward, looking around, unsure of what to do next. The wolf had disappeared into the woods, and with it, the pull he had felt. The path behind him was still open, but it didn't feel like it had before. The forest was no longer a place of peace. Now, it seemed like a place of power. The very air felt charged, alive with something Mark couldn't understand. But that strange, intense feeling in his chest, he couldn't shake it. The mark was connected to something ancient, and he had just awakened it. Mark glanced down at the strange symbols on the stone, matching them to the glowing patterns on his arm. He had felt them before, on the stone arch, but now they seemed to hold a new meaning. They were part of a larger puzzle, and he was a part of it now. He turned back to the forest and began walking once again deeper into the woods. The wolf was gone, but Mark couldn't just leave. Not now, not when. He had come so close to something important. The pull he felt was strong, and he knew that wherever it led, it would answer the questions that had been burning in his mind since the moment he had saved the wolf. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The trees stretched higher and higher, their branches twisting into shapes that seemed unnatural. It wasn't just the forest that was different. It was the very atmosphere around him. The air was thick with energy, like static before a storm. Mark could almost hear whispers. Again, faint at first, like the breeze had carried them through the trees. They were words he couldn't understand, but they were familiar. The same strange voice from before the one that had spoken to him in his mind, whispered once more, "You are close." The voice seemed to reverberate through the forest, vibrating in the very air itself. Mark's steps faltered for a moment. What was it that he was so close to? What secret did this place hold? As if answering his question, the forest opened into a small clearing, and Mark stopped dead in his tracks. Before him stood a structure that looked impossibly older than anything he had ever seen, even older than the stone arch. It was built from the same strange, glowing stone, the same material as the arch, but this structure was far larger. It was a building, a temple of sorts, covered in the same mysterious markings. The air around it seemed to hum with power, and Mark could feel the energy building up again, more intense this time. His hand went instinctively to the mark on his arm, feeling the warmth and the pulse of power that seemed to match the building's energy. Mark approached the structure, each step heavier than the last. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but it was clear that this place held the answers he had been searching for. It was like the forest itself was guiding him here, pulling him toward the truth. He reached the entrance, a massive stone door, its surface etched with the same symbols that had been on the stone arch, glowing faintly in the dim light. Mark hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was truly ready to enter, but the pull inside him The call of the forest was undeniable. With a deep breath, he placed his hand on the door. As soon as his skin made contact, the door shuddered and began to move, as though it had been waiting for him all this time. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the darkness inside. Mark stepped through the doorway, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the world seemed to change. The air was thick with power, and Mark's senses were overwhelmed. It was as if he had crossed into another realm entirely, a place that existed outside of time and space. The forest had disappeared, replaced by a vast glowing cavern that stretched endlessly in every direction. At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone pedestal, and on that pedestal rested an object that Mark could barely comprehend. It was a sphere, glowing with a soft blue light, suspended above the stone surface as if it were floating. The sphere seemed to hum with a quiet energy, and Mark could feel its power calling to him. It was the artifact, the source of the forests. Strange energy, the key to everything. As Mark approached the pedestal, the whispers returned, louder now, echoing all around him. "It has waited for you." Mark's mind raced. This was it, the artifact. The answers he had been searching for were right in front of him. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the sphere. The moment his skin touched the sphere, the ground beneath him trembled violently. Mark staggered back, his heart racing. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with words he couldn't understand. But through the chaos, one phrase stood out, clear as day. "The forest chooses." Suddenly, the walls of the cavern seemed to shift, and Mark realized that the room was not a room at all. It was alive. The structure, the markings, the sphere, it was all part of a living, breathing entity, and it was watching him. The wolf's voice echoed in his mind again. "The choice is yours." Mark's hand hovered over the sphere, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel the energy, the power it offered, but he also felt the danger. He didn't know what would happen if he touched it again, but deep down, he knew that whatever choice he made, it would change everything, and there was no turning back now. The enemy approaches. The ground still trembled beneath Mark's feet as he stood before the glowing sphere. His heart was racing, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn away. The whispers grew louder, filling his head with a cacophony of voices, each one urging him to take the next step. Yet, something in his gut told him to hesitate. "The choice is yours." Mark felt the wolf's presence behind him, its blue eyes burning with silent intensity. He turned to look at the creature, unsure of what it meant by that message. The wolf seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for Mark to make his decision. But before Mark could reach out and make that fateful choice, a sharp noise pierced the silence of the cavern. The ground beneath him shook again, this time more violently. A low rumble echoed through the walls, vibrating in his bones. Something was coming. The wolf growled softly, its fur bristling. Mark spun around, his pulse quickening. In the distance, at the far edge of the cavern, dark shadows moved. Figures, their shapes unclear in the dim light, emerged from the darkness. Mark's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, but his mind raced faster than his body. Who were these people? What were they after? The figures moved closer, their footsteps echoing in the cavern. Mark could now see them clearly, tall, humanoid figures wearing dark armor. Their eyes glowed with the same blue light as the wolf's, but there was something more sinister about them. They weren't here to protect the artifact, they were here to take it. The wolf stood tall beside Mark, its teeth bared, but it didn't move forward. It seemed to be waiting for something, just like it had before. The armored figures stopped, just a few feet away from Mark, and one of them, the leader, stepped forward. His face was hidden behind a dark helmet, but Mark could see the faint glow of blue beneath the visor, illuminating his features. "We've been waiting for you," the figure said, his voice deep and metallic, like it was coming from a speaker. Mark tensed, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. The figure tilted his head slightly. "We are the guardians of the sphere," he replied. "It is our duty to protect the power it holds, and now it is time for you to fulfill your role." Mark's mind raced. The guardians. Were these the beings that the forest had warned him about? The ones who were protecting the artifact from the wrong hands? Before Mark could respond, the wolf stepped forward, its stance protective. It growled low, its body tense with aggression. The blue glow of its eyes flared as it faced the guardians. Mark's hand tightened around the hilt of his knife, but he knew that the wolf was the one that could truly protect him now. "We will not let you take it," Mark said, his voice firm. "What do you want with the sphere?" The leader of the guardians seemed to consider him for a moment before he spoke again. "You do not understand the true nature of this artifact," he said. "It is not just a source of power. It is a key to something far greater. The forest, the sphere, is all connected, and it must be controlled." The guardian's voice dropped to a more threatening tone. "It is too late for you to stop us. The forest has already chosen." Mark's blood ran cold. The forest. Had it really chosen him? Or was he just another pawn in something far larger than he could understand? The wolf growled again, its fur bristling. Mark could feel its protective energy, its strength, radiating through the air. But he also sensed that these guardians were not ordinary beings. There was something dark about them, something that went beyond mere physical power. They were connected to the sphere, just as he was, and they would stop at nothing to control it. The leader of the guardians stepped forward again, his eyes glowing brighter. "We will not let you stand in our way," he said. "Either you join us, or you will be eliminated." Mark's grip on the knife tightened. He didn't know what the guardians wanted with the sphere, but he wasn't going to give it up without a fight. The wolf stepped closer to him, its body low to the ground, ready to spring into action. Suddenly, Mark heard a sharp crack from behind him. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw the stone pedestal where the sphere had been resting. It was glowing, brighter now, as if reacting to the threat. The entire cavern seemed to hum with energy, and Mark could feel the power coursing through the air. "We don't have much time," the leader of the Guardians said, his voice edged with urgency. "The artifact must be controlled before it consumes us all." Mark didn't fully understand what he meant, but he knew one thing for sure: the Guardians had to be stopped. They couldn't be allowed to control the sphere. The power it contained was too great for anyone to wield alone. The wolf's growl grew louder, more intense. Mark could see the change in the creatures. It was no longer just an animal. It was something more, something ancient, and it was ready to fight. Without thinking, Mark lunged forward, his knife aimed at the guardian closest to him. The wolf followed, leaping at the first figure with a speed and ferocity Mark had never seen before. The battle was on. The cavern erupted into chaos. Mark's knife clashed against the guardian's armored suit with a loud clang, and the wolf attacked with unmatched precision, its claws tearing through the air. But the guardians were ready. They moved swiftly, their armor glowing brighter with each move they made. as if they were fueled by the same energy Mark had felt coursing through his veins. In the midst of the battle, Mark's mind raced. He couldn't let these guardians take control of the sphere. They would destroy everything, and he wouldn't let that happen. Not now, not when he had come this far. The wolf fought beside him, protecting him with every swipe of its claws, every bite, and every growl. But the guardians were strong. They were not easily defeated. The air around them crackled with energy as the battle raged on, and Mark realized with a sinking feeling that this fight was only the beginning. There was something more to the artifact, something that neither he nor the guardians fully understood, but Mark was determined to find out. The battle for the artifact. The cavern shook with the force of the battle. Mark's knife clashed against the guardian's armor once more, but he barely had time to recover before the figure swung a massive arm toward him, sending him crashing backward into the stone wall. The air was thick with energy, and Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. The wolf was still fighting fiercely, darting through the guardians with incredible speed, its glowing blue eyes never leaving its targets. But despite the wolf's strength and agility, the guardians were relentless. Mark pushed himself to his feet, his head spinning, his limbs aching. The energy in the cavern was growing more intense with each passing second. He could feel the power of the artifact pulsing around him as if it were alive, watching the battle unfold. The stone pedestal where the sphere had rested now gleamed with an otherworldly light, its glow growing stronger, the power within it slowly leaking into the atmosphere. "We must stop this," Mark shouted to the wolf, but the creature's growls were drowned out by the chaotic clash of steel and energy. Mark could feel the urgency now. If the guardians gained control of the artifact, everything would change. The forest, the sphere, the power, none of it would be the same. The delicate balance that had been in place for centuries would crumble. The leader of the guardians swung his glowing weapon toward Mark, but the wolf lunged just in time, sinking its sharp teeth into the guardian's armored arm. The figure staggered back with a pained grunt, shaking the wolf off. Mark took the opportunity to strike again, his knife cutting through the air toward the guardian's exposed side. The guardian blocked it with a swipe of his arm, but Mark's strike found its mark. A deep gash appeared along the guardian's arm, and Mark saw a flicker of something, a faint, unnatural energy radiate from the wound. It wasn't blood, but a glowing fluid substance that seemed to pulse with the same energy that surrounded the artifact. Mark's heart sank. The guardians weren't entirely human. They were connected to the artifact, to the forest, and to something far older than Mark could even comprehend. "We are not just your enemies," the leader of the guardians said, his voice tinged with something almost sorrowful. "We are the keepers of the power that has been entrusted to us. We have been chosen to protect the balance, and you are just a pawn in a game you don't understand." Mark's breath hitched. The wolf had been trying to protect him, but the guardians had been right. He hadn't fully grasped the implications of what he was doing. He had been drawn into this war, not just as a participant, but as a key player in the game for control of the forest, the sphere, and the very fabric of reality. The leader's eyes flashed with cold determination. "The artifact must be controlled," he repeated. "It is not a weapon to be wielded by anyone, especially not you." Mark's mind raced. The guardians wanted the power of the artifact for themselves, but he couldn't let that happen. Not when the energy it held could change the entire world. It wasn't just about the forest anymore. It was about control, about balance, about the fate of everything connected to it. Mark realized he had to make a choice. Either he would fight to protect the artifact or the entire world would fall into the hands of the Guardians. The wolf was relentless in its attack, its claws slashing, its fangs snapping, but the Guardians were too strong. The battle was starting to turn in their favor. Mark glanced back at the pedestal, where the artifact pulsed with a growing energy. If he didn't act soon, they would lose everything. Suddenly, a thought struck him. There was another way. He didn't have to fight the Guardians head-on. He didn't have to rely on his knife or his strength alone. There was something else, something hidden within him that had awakened with the mark on his arm. The energy was there, inside him, just like the artifact had called to him from the very beginning. Mark took a deep breath and closed his eyes, reaching for the strange energy coursing through his veins. He could feel it now, the same power that had been inside the artifact, the same energy that had connected him to the wolf and the forest. It was inside him, alive and waiting to be unlocked. He didn't need the artifact to control it. He had been connected to it all along. His hand shot out, and with a sharp cry, he released the energy within him. The cavern lit up in a blinding flash of blue, the ground shaking violently as the power of the sphere collided with the energy Mark had unleashed. The air was thick with a force that threatened to tear everything apart. The Guardians staggered back, their armor flickering with the shockwaves of the blast. Mark felt the power surge through him, felt it coursing through his veins, through his very soul. But as the energy built, Mark knew what he had to do. He couldn't just wield the power, he had to release it. He had to let it flow freely both for the forest and for the balance of the world. With one final heart-stopping push, Mark opened himself to the power, releasing it into the cavern. The shockwave of energy exploded outward, sending the Guardians reeling and forcing the walls of the cavern to crumble. The artifact, the stone pedestal, and everything surrounding it glowed with an ethereal brilliance, the energy harmonizing with the forces that had been awakened. The cavern trembled and cracked as the energy raced outward, reshaping everything it touched. The Guardians cried out, their forms flickering and fading as the force tore through their bodies. And then, in an instant, they were gone. The cavern fell silent. Mark stood, panting, as the dust settled. His body ached, and his vision blurred, but he felt the power ebb away, leaving behind a strange sense of peace. He had done it. He had released the energy, and in doing so, he had destroyed the Guardian's hold on the artifact. But as the light from the artifact faded, Mark knew the fight wasn't over. He had won this battle, but there were still unanswered questions, still dangers lurking in the shadows. The power of the artifact was too great, too volatile, and somewhere, someone would always want it. But for now, Mark and the wolf stood alone. In the heart of the cavern, the echoes of the battle still ringing in their ears. The final revelation, the dust settled slowly in the cavern as Mark stood alone amidst the ruins. The power of the artifact had been unleashed, the Guardians vanquished, and the cavern itself had begun to collapse under the force of the explosion of energy. Mark's body ached from the exertion, but in the silence that followed, there was a strange sense of calm. The battle was over, but he could feel that the war was far from finished. Mark took a deep breath, his mind trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The wolf, still standing beside him, watched the destruction with quiet intensity. Its blue eyes glowed faintly, the same ethereal light that had guided him throughout his journey. The wolf had been his protector, his ally, but now Mark felt as though their bond had deepened into something more, a connection that went beyond the physical world. He glanced at the stone pedestal. now empty of the glowing sphere. It had faded into nothingness, leaving behind only the memory of its immense power. But Mark knew that whatever had been contained within the artifact had been released. The energy had coursed through him, awakened something deep within, and altered the very fabric of the world around him. The forest had changed. The balance of power had shifted. And Mark had no idea what that meant for the future. Suddenly, he heard a low, distant sound, a hum, almost imperceptible but growing louder with every passing second. It wasn't the same as the whispers he had heard before. It was something different, something deeper, and Mark felt it in his bones. The energy in the cavern was still alive, pulsing beneath the surface, as if it was calling out to him, beckoning him to understand its true nature. The wolf's eyes locked onto Mark's, and for a moment the creature seemed to speak to him. Silently, it wasn't just a beast anymore. It was something ancient, something tied to the very heart of the forest, and it was guiding him. He knew now that his journey wasn't over. The final revelation was close. With a heavy heart, Mark turned away from the pedestal and walked toward the back of the cavern. The stone walls, cracked and crumbling from the energy release, seemed to be alive. The markings that had covered the surfaces of the stones were now glowing faintly once again, and Mark could feel them resonating with the energy inside him. The wolf followed closely behind him, its steps silent on the rocky ground. Mark didn't know where this path would lead him, but he knew that he had to follow it. He had uncovered the first layer of the mystery, but there was so much more hidden beneath the surface. The forest, the artifact, the guardian's, it was all part of something larger, something ancient that had been waiting for him. As Mark walked deeper into the cavern, the walls seemed to shift. The markings on the stone became clearer, more defined, as though they were revealing a story, one that had been written long ago, but had remained hidden until now. The hum grew louder, and Mark could feel the power radiating from the very walls of the cavern. It was like the forest itself was speaking to him. He came to a large stone door, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols. This wasn't like the entrance to the cavern. This was different. The door seemed to pulse with energy, as though it was alive, waiting for him to unlock it. He knew, deep down, that this was the final test. The door wasn't just a barrier, it was the gateway to the truth. Mark reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on the surface of the stone door. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming. He could feel his heart racing, his breath quickening. The energy inside him, the same energy that had been awakened when he first touched the sphere, responded. It was as if the door recognized him, recognized the mark on his arm. The symbols on the door began to shift, rearranging themselves into a new pattern, one that Mark hadn't seen before. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, and the door began to move. Slowly, the heavy stone creaked and groaned, opening to reveal a vast chamber beyond. Mark stepped forward, his hands still resting on the door as it swung open. The light from the cavern behind him faded, and the air in the chamber seemed thick with ancient power. It was a room unlike any he had ever seen. Its walls were lined with glowing symbols, each one pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light dot. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, much larger than the one where the artifact had rested, and atop that pedestal there was something Mark could barely comprehend. It was a crystal, glowing with an inner light, its surface covered in intricate, swirling patterns. It radiated power far more than anything he had encountered before. Mark could feel it in his bones, calling to him, just as the sphere had. But this was different. This was the heart of the forest. This was the true source of the power. The wolf moved to his side, its eyes never leaving the crystal. Mark knew that this was it. This was the final piece of the puzzle. He had come this far, and now the truth was within his grasp. He approached the pedestal cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch the crystal. As his fingers made contact, a wave of energy washed over him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he felt as though he was being pulled into the crystal itself. It was as though the entire universe was collapsing in on him, drawing him into a singularity of light and power, and then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The energy faded, and Mark found himself standing in the chamber once again. The wolf was beside him, its eyes wide with understanding. But Mark could feel something inside him had changed. The truth had been revealed. The crystal, the heart of the forest, had connected him to something beyond this world. It wasn't just about power or control. It was about balance. The forest had chosen him not to wield the power, but to protect it, to be its guardian, and now Mark understood his role. He wasn't just a traveler in this world. He was a protector of the balance between the worlds, the one who had been chosen to keep the forest safe from those who would use its power for their own gain. As the light from the crystal faded, Mark felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the journey was far from over. But now he knew what he had to do. He had become part of something much larger than himself, and in that moment, the forest whispered its final secret. The protector has awakened.